Hey there, I'm David Lesmes, and you are listening to a podcast that showcases the powerful stories of extraordinary Latinos impacting the world and leaving their mark on the global stage. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to UPRISE Latino. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to UPRISE Latino, a space to share the positive impact of Latin America and Latino ideas around the world. Today podcast is going to be a bit different to the previous episodes because perhaps I'm going to fulfill one of the dreams of many people in certain sense, and is being able to talk with an idea, being able to discuss with a concept, being able to explore how an idea affects me or builds upon the things that I'm thinking. And I'm really happy that you guys are going to join me in this journey. So, to start and to introduce this idea, I first need to talk about UPRISE Latino, and is why I decided to do this podcast. And we have discussed a bit about this in the past, but just to recap really fast, is I feel from my experience and from what I've seen talking with people in different places and in different moments of my life, that right now in the world there is a special interest in Latin America. There is a special interest in our region and on other regions of the South because the dominant narratives of the global North are starting to be challenged. The considerations of what is truth, the considerations of what is perceived or seen as positive, perceived and seen as valuable, are being challenged. And we can start seeing this from topics like music, to arts, to architecture, to academia, and of course in other concepts in economics, in politics, and in social topics. But especially in cultural topics, I think that right now Latin America has a golden opportunity to be one of the regions that is going to provide a different concept about what the future can be and how can we build up on the things that we have learned in our identity and in the way that we relate with other parts of the world to propose a new vision or to help the world move forward. In that sense, I had the pleasure of finding one concept that is fascinating and that has been in my mind during the last 2-3 weeks. I've been trying to research about it, I've been trying to read about it, but it's difficult to find information. Oh, this idea is quite new. And in that sense, I'm going to introduce to you an idea. So I have today with me Tropical Metamodernism, that from now on I'm going to call TM. This is going to be difficult to repeat every single time, Tropical Metamodernism. So for everyone that is listening, we're going to be talking about TM. And this concept is built on other things relative to metamodernism that is already a complex concept. So I want to start there. I want to start understanding where this idea comes from. Where is the origin of this idea? Welcome, TM.
Thank you, David. Absolute pleasure to be here. I think UPRISE Latino and Tropical Metamodernism have a lot to explore together, and I would even say that these are two different perspectives of the same thing, right? Two different facets of the same polygon, let's say. And so I think it's very exciting to be exploring this intersection together today.
Good.
Let's start then by talking about metamodernism, as you suggested yourself. So where metamodernism comes from where you are. Metamodernism was born in the Nordic countries in the turn of the 2010s, right? So we're talking about more or less 15 years ago already. It started to develop between a mix of artists, art historians, and then philosophers in the Nordics and in in the Netherlands as well. Kind of theoretizing, right? Creating theories around what comes next as a stage of social development or of social movements and cultural movements after postmodernism, right? So to understand metamodernism, we need to understand the history of cultural social movements, right? So if we start, and this is a lot of the work, if anyone wants to dive deeper, the work of Ken Wilber and the integral theory to me is perhaps the best explanation of this whole process up until, like the metamodern, let's say, paradigm, right? But we can roughly, simplify the structures. It's much more in depth in Wilber's books to talk about three kinds of moments of society. The first are traditional societies, right? And traditional societies might be what you would imagine medieval Europe to be like, right? Or a kingdom in India, like in the 1700s, like um, they are very hierarchical. They are a lot of times very religious, and they're very, let's say, conservative in the terms of society rules and norms are very rigid and follow the patterns of the beliefs, right? The political beliefs, the religious beliefs, the cultural beliefs, and they're very stable, let's say, in that sense, right? And this is, and many times associated with pre dawn of science, right? So if you would imagine the standard of living in those societies, a lot of inequality, right? Usually there's like a monarchy or a royal family or a privileged class, right? And a lot of people in misery, a lot of people suffering, a lot of deaths, very premature deaths. So this is kind of traditional societies, okay, and traditional kind of ways of thinking, very hierarchical, very rigid. Then the next stage, right, if we think historically, started to develop around the 1800s with the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment movement that really started with the Renaissance in Italy a bit before that, a few centuries before, but really came to its full expression during the Enlightenment and the philosophers in Europe kind of bringing this concept of freedom of thinking and of the scientific method and all the discoveries, both on the objective sciences and the social sciences that came out of that, right? So reasoning, dialogue, right? Like bringing back a bit of that ancient Greek and philosophy and ways of approaching the concept of democracy or participation and rights, human rights, even if not for all humans back then, right? But one might say that this development arch of society is slowly but surely including more and more people into the realm of consideration, right? If the traditional societies is basically just the royalties and the privileged class, then you start to expand more to, like urban citizens. And of course, there's still slavery at that time, right? So there's still this inequality that's very baked in and present. But, you start bringing more people in, and you start really having this element of objective reasoning in science and this concept of progress, right? Which is, goes hand in hand with the rise of capitalism, right? At that time. So if we had traditional societies before, then these become what we call modern societies, right? And we might say that until today, most of the world, right, like the dominant mode of living and thinking is still the modern society, right? The modern paradigm, let's say that, right? And is what has driven, like the economy and GDP as a measure of success, and technology drives the economy, which drives more technology. And, like we send people to schools, we educate the masses, right? That before was like we educate the masses to go to factories, and now we educate the masses so they can work in office jobs. And now who knows, we're facing that challenge nowadays. But it's this paradigm of democracy, representative democracy, liberal economies, market economies, and science, right, as basically the source of truth. The source of truth is science. If we think of our societies nowadays, very much still the source of truth is science, whereas before the source of truth was God, right? So it's theology,
Mm.
right? It
Yeah.
was like the divine law, and now in modern societies it's science. Ultimately, even if you go to court, it will be decided upon, like they bring the experts, if it's a technical matter or not, to decide that, right? So it's science is the ultimate measure of truth in a modern society. And all went well in modern societies, and like post World War II boom of European and American ways of living. But around that time, around the 1960s, particularly in Europe and particularly in France, a bunch of social theorists, sociologists and philosophers, and very much also tied to the anthropology study of primitive quote unquote peoples, started to realize that there's a bunch of problems and issues with the modern society and way of living. Most importantly, there's this fallacy or this lie of objectivity, right? That modern society is all hinged on this idea of we can measure things, and everything is definite, and there's objective truth, right? This concept of objective truth is a very modern thing, right? Like from science, from reasoning. And around that time we started seeing the problems of structural racism, of structural inequality, the whole post-colonial movement, right? And it's becoming glaring and very apparent, like the issues of these universal rights that actually only apply to a structural hierarchical privileged class, right? And now it's not like like a small class within a country. Now, no, it's the whole country. For example, it's the whole of France has a privilege over all of the colonies, right? And there's a lot of hypocrisy there. So the postmodern, right, which is what comes after the modern, comes out of understanding on one side these problems around the moral and ethical justifications of science and objectivity, and then on this aspect of the objective truth and of the measurability and the controlling, right? This narrative of the universe as being basically a big mechanism, right? That if we only could measure the whole universe, then we could predict everything and we could understand everything that was before, right? So it's a vision of materialism, right? Like it's very important that the universe is dead, right? Like life and consciousness are only epiphenomenon of our neuron connections. There's no such thing as the soul, right? It's the
Mm.
modernity basically killed the theology and denied a lot of the stuff from there. And
Yeah.
so it's a vision of a universe, a cosmology, right? Of a dead universe, a dead mechanical universe, right?
Mm.
Where our feelings, our sensations of joy and love are all just chemical overflowing inside our brains. And values, what we think of as beauty, right, and truth, are actually just social conventions, right?
Mm.
That's the vision of science, right? The vision of science, the only truth that exists is the physical truth, what can be measured. Everything
Yeah.
else is a social convention, right? It's just an agreement. And what can be beautiful in a tribe in Polynesia might be horrible for a tribe in Brazil. And why? Because beauty is subjective, right? And the only thing that exists is everything that's objective. So the postmodernists they start to see the structural problems in terms of inequality and oppression and racism, sexism, classism, right? Um, and connected to the science bit, they start to see the cracks of the scientific narrative of the world actually from within the scientific field and from within physics, which is known to be the hardest of the sciences, right? Like if you think
Yeah,
of
yeah.
that hierarchy of social sciences, history, and then history depends on biology, which is alive, that depends on chemistry, that depends on physics. And actually, it was from physics, which is known to be the hardest of science, that the cracks of the scientific explanation of the world start to appear because of quantum physics and all of the spooky discoveries and effects that even Einstein, couldn't explain, and he called them, spooky, because it didn't make sense from within a cosmological narrative of power, of control over the universe of the modern world. Didn't make sense, right? And so the postmoderns basically start to put together this critique in the 60s, right? That is showing the cracks in the armor of the modern paradigm. And since the 60s, that has developed into what we can call today, critical race theory, critical social theory, right? The woke movement, right? That those are some kind of pejorative nowadays, I think, labels to it. But I think the other flip side of that is social justice. Like a big part of the social justice movement comes from the postmodern critiques of the modern structures that show these inequalities and how we actually have to combat them, right? And bring value back to the subjective, right? That the subjective matters, right? So nowadays you can say that, for example, the Nordic countries is where you see the most prevalence and the most development of the postmodern paradigm, right, and model of society developed with this very strong social welfare state and the culture that is very against show off, and it's not like you actually hide your wealth instead of showing your wealth. There's this cultural zeitgeist of like searching for equality and searching for fairness and searching
Hmm.
for access to opportunity to all, right? Which is the response to these critiques of the postmodern world, right? So this, you can say, is the postmodern societies that we have. Examples of postmodern societies would be um, the Nordic societies nowadays, right? And I think it's important to actually say that there's never, a full postmodern or full modern. No, these things are very fluid and are very, transformational, and they're never the same, right? Like the expressions of modernism in one country are going to be different than in another, and in every country there's going to be usually a mix of, like, oh, a majority of people are in this model, are operating under this model, and a few are on these, or a few are on these. So it's important to understand that. So when I say that the Nordic countries are postmodern, what I mean is that most people in the Nordic countries operate under a postmodern worldview, right? But you
Hmm.
still have a big majority of people that in the Nordic countries are the conservatives that operate under a modern view, right? And then you have very, very few people in the Nordic countries that are still, religious fundamentalists, right? So that's what I mean by that, right? So having understood traditional, modern, and postmodern, we get back to 2010 in the Nordics, in Sweden, in Denmark, in the Netherlands as well. That is not a Nordic country. That was part of the brewing of this soup, right? It has a lot of Nordic influences. Um, and you get to this point where a lot of these art historians and philosophers and sociologists start to imagine what comes next, right? What comes after the postmodern, the postmodern, one might say. And the name that they come to define that theory of the next stage of development of society is the metamodern, right? And meta modern can have different meanings. This Greek prefix meta can mean above, it can mean beyond, it can mean basically greater than, right? It's a step of complexity higher. But they chose that exactly because of the complexity of the term itself. So it's after postmodern, so it's meta-modern, it's post-postmodern, but it's also above in the sense that it tries to integrate the three previous models of society. So it gets some elements of the traditional society, some elements of the modern, and some elements of the postmodern, and try to integrate them in a greater whole, right, with more coherence. And the biggest key there, right, the biggest insight of the meta-modern is the understanding of psychological development, right? And that our societies organize themselves and structure themselves through collaboration, cooperation, and that each individual lives in their own basically psychological world. And the complexity of that world is tremendous, right? From the cognition side to the IQ side, the complex thinking side, to the emotional capabilities, social emotional capacity, to the restraint of violence, and then to the elements of communication, right? Of the diversity of symbols and the grammar that one is able to express, and even different languages that one can speak, but the number of words and how they can put together these words, to form complex thoughts in different languages as well. So this is the whole world of psychological dimension. That before this, right, there was basically they called it a blindness. There was a blindness to the psychological world, and now the metamodern world model of thinking actually focuses on that as the centerpiece for improving all of the other things, right? Or basically for living a meaningful life, a whole life, right? And so by unlocking that, the meta-modern worldview proposes one that is extremely oriented towards reason and dialogue and uncovering, truths, but is much less arrogant than the modern one, right? In the sense that it says, like, we don't know everything. Science is not able to measure everything, and or it might be, but we don't know yet. And to claim that it is perhaps too early. It's too soon, right? We have to still figure it out. We have to try. And alternative theses, explanations for what the world is and could be are welcome, right? So on the sense of ontology, right? Some dimensions here. Ontology is what the world is our worldview, right? It's basically what is real. What is real?
Yeah.
So it's open to alternative explanations more than just the material, right? You can say that it's agnostic, right? It's not spiritual, but it's agnostic. It's like we still don't know yet, and it actually is counterproductive to deny the existence of other things outright, just because of historical factors, which is what the modernity had to do, right? By going from traditional to modern society, there had to be a very strong atheist revolution almost. Otherwise, there would be no space for the creation of science and development of that and so on and so forth. But now, 300 years later, we have the maturity and we've understood enough about the world to say, actually, there might be a soul. Who knows? We just don't. It's not. No one can prove it right now, and no one can unprove it, right? So let's keep our humbleness, our scientific humbleness. Let's go back to the essence of the scientific method, and explore, right? And have hypotheses, and don't cross hypotheses just because we don't like them ideologically, right?
Yeah.
So that's the second factor. The first is ontology. The second is ideology, right? And ideology is the collection of narratives that determine what is right, what is wrong, what is beautiful, what is success, what is fair, what is unfair, right? It's this guidelines that society uses to determine, what is progress. What is progress? That's determined by the ideology, right? And so there's the metamodern ontology is much more humble and open. And the metamodern ideology actually focuses specifically on the psychological element. It's like, listen, GDP is a bad measure. It's too simple, right? It's the world is very complex to be reduced to GDP as a measure of success. And that was a critique of the postmoderns. So let's just focus on one thing that we all can agree on that matters, right? And what can be that thing? Psychological development, right?
Okay.
Can we all agree that people should, everyone should have the capacity and the opportunities and the conditions to learn, to develop their complex thinking, to develop ways of expressing themselves, to develop their social emotional intelligence, to heal from their traumas, to have what we call mental health, right? To be cured from mental health issues, right?
Yeah.
Can we all agree that at the very essence of society, that should be the yardstick of progress and of what determining, in the trickle downs, what is fair, what is not fair, what is legal, what is illegal. Like, let's just focus on that, because at its very essence, if we do that, if we create conditions for every citizen to develop themselves psychologically, to heal from their traumas, to have a more complex vocabulary, to think in more complex ways, have more access to information and be able to put them together and dialogue and debate and discern, one thing from the other and truth from false, right? And determined by themselves. If we can do that, the metamodern theory says, all the rest will be much easier. It will not automatically get solved, but all the rest will be much easier. Solving climate change will be easier. Thinking about economical development will be easier. Thinking about economical inequality, political polarization, thinking about AI risks, thinking about war. So basically, that's the basic insight is that, right? That we're moving in this direction. So the ideology is very centered around the psychological development of the individuals, right? And the last piece that determines the kind of paradigm. So the first is ontology, ideology, and the last is identity, right?
Okay.
And identity, if we were to say, right, what are the narratives for identity for all of these different paradigms? On medieval Europe, on a traditional kind of Christian narrative of identity, one might say, I am a soul, I'm a sinner, and I have to, I am part of this population of souls that is in this earth, doing my best here to go to heaven, right? But I am a soul in the midst of all the souls here on earth. On a modern narrative, one might say, I am an individual, right? I am one individual. I am a person. I have rights, right? Rights and responsibilities as a citizen, as part of this, right? And I have my life, my issues that are, there's the aspect of freedom to the individual, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of thinking. But there's very centered around the individual, and this individualism is very strong part of the belief of the modern paradigm.
Yeah.
And then on the postmodern, it starts to actually see, there is no such thing as the individual by itself.
The individual. Yeah.
The individual is a product of the social, right?
Yeah.
The individual exists only in society unless he or she is a hermit, in a cave somewhere, far away. But everyone else that lives in society exists in society. So the individual actually is alive, right? And we actually are much more influenced by the collective and the culture and the habits and the rituals than what the modernist thought, right? So it's this focus on I actually am part of several different communities with different value systems and different beliefs that influence me, right? The metamodern identity, right, is again a type of combination of all the three, right? So it's this concept that actually Jacques Deleuze in the postmodern epoch came up with this concept of the individual, right?
Hmm.
The individual is not individual, and it's not fully just, a part of the whole, but it's both. I am an individual and I am part of the whole. I am both at the same time. And we are in perpetual co-creation, right? It's perpetual flow. I am, we are, you are, I am, and it's this co-creation process, right? Which connects, by the way, the metamodern note, going back to the religion, and specifically to the aspect of Eastern religion. And in the West, actually, we have a lot of tradition in the Gnostic Christian
Yeah.
traditions, right? That were completely eradicated by Constantine when they came up with the canon and in
Yeah.
354. But actually, there's strong Gnostic traditions that talk about this as well. They talk about the power of the individual, the seed that lies within, right? Like these narratives of Eastern philosophy around purpose, right? Like, why
Yeah.
were you born here, right? Like, and everyone was born to do something, right?
Mm.
With a purpose, with a gift, right? With a seed that has to flourish, right? So if we combine all of these three things, you kind of get a bit to the metamodern ideology, which is this belief, this fundamental belief in the capacity and the power and the potential of every single individual to do something meaningful. Every
Yeah.
single individual. And that these individuals exist both as unique parts of themselves and as parts of a whole, right?
Yeah.
So it's this juxtaposition of these three things. In sum, this is the metamodern in the context of the postmodern, the modern, and the traditional.
Good. And I'm going to jump in there. First of all, TM, thank you so much for the masterclass in sociology, philosophy, history. Really, really good. It reminds me a lot of my favorite professor in university. He was a sociology of law. And he had this passion of talking about these concepts in that way. But I want to come back to something, and let me see if I can articulate myself to jump into the tropical part. That is the idea
Yes.
of UPRISE Latino. Something that you mentioned, and in the way that you were explaining, in that we started to be more and more conscious, is this evolution of the concept of society is really European centered.
Mm-hmm.
When the Europeans start to expand over the world, one of their ways of dominations is to impose that their way of seeing the things. So we lost a lot in certain societies more than others, but as you were finalizing with this, we lost a lot of information of
Mm-hmm.
the Arab world, of the Asian world, of the African world, and of course of the Latin American world. And with the modernism, those kind of traditions, those kind of expressions, those kind of understandings of the world were even pushed more, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also for context, for the people, I live in Sweden, so that is the country that I am right now. And even in these countries that right now, or that are representing in some way that concept of metamodernism, there is fractures. And the
Yes.
people start to see fractures in the narratives, even in those developed narratives. And that's where I want to connect, because there is a curiosity to those ways of seeing the world that were crushed by the expansion of the European point of view. Therefore, that's where I feel that curiosity comes. And why I feel that there is these ruptures, it starts by the in Europe and in North America, the romanticization of the past, especially of the 50s, of the 60s, of the 70s, when they were developing this dominant narrative. But now we are seeing more and more different ways of seeing the world. And one of those ways is the tropical one, the Latin American one. And of course, we can do another two podcasts maybe to talk about more of the how the Asian communities and how the Buddhist communities and how the African communities have such a giant influence. But let's focus on Latam. So how this metamodern concept is perceived for a society like Latin American that is still quite religious, that is still in the process of development, that is still a bit behind in the rest of technology. How does it feel, or what is the taste that we give in our part of the world?
Perfect. So I would say that, tropical metamodernism, right? We've only spoken about metamodernism so far, but tropical
Now we're talking about
metamodernism,
you.
now I'm talking about myself. Yes, now I'm
Yeah,
talking
now
about
you're presenting yourself.
exactly. So tropical metamodernism is very much still emerging. There is no clear definition. I would say that tropical metamodernism are more questions, open-ended questions than answers, right? And what you said about the fractures in the developed world already, I think is very relevant to start from there, because from the 2010s to today, when this was like developed, a lot has changed. A lot of historians and sociologists actually say that probably the peak of modern and even postmodern society was 2015, and that was about the same time that this was really metamodernism was really maturing and going to public, right? Um, since then, we've seen, of course, climate change more and more real and prevalent. We have seen Trump and Brexit and the rise of the far right, across Latin America and in Europe and in the US, um, and this has already started to show kind of the fractures of that. The questions, let's say, that tropical metamodernism asks in this context, right, is given that in the Nordic countries, they went through this whole process of development to get to a society where metamodern possibility, right? Metamodernism is not a reality in the Nordics, it's a
Mm,
possibility, right?
it is, yeah.
Postmodernism is a reality, but the possibility was able to come to life in that context. What then? And if we, I think that's the big premise, if we agree that metamodernism as a paradigm, as an ontology, an ideology, and narratives for identity is desirable and is superior, is better than the postmodern, the modern, the traditional, and even before the traditional, the indigenous ones, which I think are very relevant for Latin America. if
100%.
we if we think like it is superior, and I think it is superior because it actually can get the best of all the different pieces and try to put them together in a way that's coherent, in a way that integrates all the best and solves the issues and blind spots of all of them. Then how might we in Latin America, in a context that is completely different than the Nordic country, how might we think about going from where we are today to this meta-modern society, right?
Mm, big jump.
Big jump, big jump. And the most important, I think, element of that is recognizing that it's not going to be the same path that Europe and the Nordics had to go through, right? Because right now, even in the Nordics, we see the cracks showing, right? So the
Yeah.
path has not been ideal. We're not
Hmm.
even getting there necessarily, right? Like with the rise of the far right, like the meta-modern. Some might say that it was more possible back then than it is today. In Sweden, for example, right?
Mm.
That in Sweden in 2015 you had a better society than you have nowadays. Some might argue. So given that this path and the conditions that were created are apparently not working and are not going to give rise to a metamodern society necessarily, it might, you don't know. So that's one thing. Maybe it's not this path. And two, this path that the Nordic countries took and the European countries in general took, it was full of violence, full of
Yeah.
suffering, full of exploitation of previous colonies, and full of waste. Because of this whole modern consumerist capitalist of buying stupid shit that you don't need just for the sake of moving the needle of GDP and
Yeah.
marketing and advertising, convincing people of the lifestyles and traumatizing them, and girls with anorexia and guys with body dysmorphia and taking supplements and all of these harms along the way, and these a waste of time, a waste of energy, a waste of capital, a waste of resources, a waste of natural resources that has gotten to a place that might not even be the best place for the metamodern to arrive, right? So Latin America, looking at that, saying, okay, we really have to change course here. If we
Yeah.
want to get to a metamodern place, we can't go through modern to postmodern to maybe metamodern. It's not working there. It's not working. And even if it was working there, we have a completely different dynamic here. Completely
Totally.
different dynamic. So the fundamental question of tropical metamodernism is, how might we as Latinos in Latin America and in the diaspora think about development of Latin America if we want to get to a metamodern society? How might we think about development? What does development look like today to go from where we are today? And to be able to answer that question, we have to understand what is the context today, right?
Yeah.
So if we think that, in Sweden we have a majority of postmoderns and a few, moderns and a very small minority of traditionals, in Latin America, depending on the country, but overall, you might say actually, you have almost, 40%, I would say, that are still traditional religious fundamentalists, even. Traditional religious fundamentalists, 40%, maybe more. I would say another 40%, that are modern, are in the modern paradigm. They're urbanized. They're living in the cities. They have modern jobs, office jobs.
Yeah.
They went to college. They live modern lives. They watch Netflix, and they live that kind of paradigm.
Buying Amazon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You'd have about, I think, across total of Latin America, about 10%. 10% that are still in the indigenous paradigm before the traditional.
Yeah. That's super important. And
Super
that I think that
important.
is essential.
Super important. Super important. But that are still before, which is, I simplified the stages, but before the
Yeah.
traditional, you actually had these other forms, right? The animistic, the archaic, the Faustian. And one of them, is this aspect of indigenous ways of living, right? Traditional, very
Yeah.
animistic, like everything is alive and has a soul, the wind, the sun, the earth, the spirits of the forest, and
Absolutely.
what that
That.
entails, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think you still have about, I'm being generous here, but let's say between 5 and 10% of the population that still lives under that paradigm, be it like remote in the jungle or in transition, right? But still believe
Yeah.
more in that than in, Catholicism or Christianity, or that's more important to them than, science and the modern day state and what's on television. And then you have the final bit, which are the postmoderns,
Mm.
which I would say is between, let's say 15%.
Yeah.
Which are, let's say, the liberal intellectual elites in the capitals across Latin America. in the national and state capitals, there are going to be, where there's a university that teaches philosophy and teaches law and teaches sociology, there will be a part of postmodern thinkers in that region. Now, very different context than the Nordics, right?
Super different context.
Very different context in terms of the mix of the ideologies present. And on the other side, if we think about the other kinds of conditions that are present, we see that objectively speaking, there's less financial capital available per capita.
That is, yeah, absolutely.
A lot less. There is financial poverty, right?
Yeah.
And one might say that structurally, there are very inefficient bureaucracies. There are corrupt bureaucracies, right? That really prevent, like innovation and investments and also big public, relevant works to happen efficiently. And these, let's say, are the challenges, the limitations I would highlight: the scarcity of financial capital, the inefficiencies in the bureaucratic systems, corrupt processes, and a culture of corruption. And I would highlight one more, which is a tremendous degree of collective trauma. A tremendous degree of collective trauma. People in Latin America experience until today, and have experienced historically in the short-term past, a lot more violence than the citizens of the Nordics have.
100%.
A lot more violence. And this is tremendously important because when we think about psychological development, to me, one of the most important things at the foundation of that is the trauma healing that unlocks a lot of the things. If you are afraid, you cannot think complex thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And the trauma is nothing but a response reaction to a violence that was ingrained in you. So now, even if you don't have the stimulus of the violence anymore, you still have the fear response. It's still there. You're projecting the violent stimulus
100%.
for defense. You need to protect yourself.
Yeah, of course.
It's better to have that trauma and protect if the violence comes than not to protect and get the violence again, right?
Yeah.
So it's evolutionary psychology. Trauma is a response mechanism that developed very clearly through evolutionary mechanisms. It's important to highlight that because the amount of trauma is so big in Latin America. People have been abused. People have been through hunger. People have a sense of fear because of violence in their environments, the safety, the gangs, kidnappings, murders. People are afraid to get, stopped by the police asking for bribes all the time. Robberies. Can't park my car, and then I'm going to get, my car's going to get stolen. Need to have, cameras in my house. So the degree of trauma is really big. But it's not only negative things in the context here, right?
100%.
And I wanted to highlight a few of the positive things of the context in comparison to Europe, right? That I think are very different. The first, which we already spoke about, is the presence of indigenous thinking.
100%.
Which is key. The presence of indigenous thinking and indigenous wisdom in our societies, not just in terms of that 5 to 10% of people who are still operating in that paradigm, but the fact that institutionally, collectively, even if we grow up to have a modern or postmodern education, we still learn about indigenous thinking when we're in school here. We learn about the tribes, we learn about the beliefs, we learn about whatever that is, because it's much more recent, right? For example, in Brazil, in 1988, we had our latest constitution, and it enshrined indigenous rights in the constitution. Because in Brazil, we still have a large amount of the population that is indigenous, right?
Same thing in Colombia.
Something that didn't happen, for example, in Europe, because the indigenous peoples of Europe were already decimated by the Romans.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the colonization process of Europe and the dissemination, the destruction of indigenous thinking, right? The Celtic thinking in England, for example, was completely destroyed by Roman domination while it was there, right? Partially, but then it
Mm.
faded out, like, so it's much more distant in the collective past, in the collective imaginary in Europe, this indigenous wisdom, right? And for us, it's much more alive. It's dying. We're trying to take care of it, but it's dying. But it's still alive.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
still present here. There's still the fire is still burning there. It's a little bit,
Yeah.
but it's still burning, and we can rekindle it, and we can use that to light the fire of tropical metamodernism.
Mm.
Traditional societies and traditional religious thinking, although has a lot of problematic elements with fundamentalism and oppression and like against gays and oppression of women and like anti-science and flat earthers and so on and so forth, it brings with it something that is very powerful in the times that we are living right now and in the decades that we will start to live ahead. In these coming decades, we will start witnessing, the meta crisis, the polycrisis, or the collapse of the modern industrial, society,
Yeah.
capitalist system. And in face of those collapses, and in face of the environmental collapse, Latin America has a secret weapon. It has in store, and that is called faith and hope.
Exactly.
And that is something that if you ask a few people, you can tell me this, David, in Sweden, what's the biggest problem that they see around? I bet you a few people will say it's hopelessness.
Mm-hmm. It is.
It's nihilism. It's a
Yeah.
sense of purposelessness, that everything is meaningless. Why care? Why do anything at all? Right? We're all going to die from climate change, or Russia is going to bomb us, or whatever it is. There's an apathy, a sense of apathy that manifests, as depression, that manifests as escapism into video games, into pornography, into consumption, into
Mm.
drinking. All these are escapism, because at the very
Mm.
core, the fire is dead in those people. They feel meaninglessness. They feel purposelessness. So they
Yeah.
escape. They escape.
Yeah.
They escape. Escape to what they can. And they entertain themselves to death. Here we have, because of this large contingent of religious and traditional ways of thinking, and even, the people that are modern or postmodern thinking still have that in them. There's a collective sense of hope. There's a
Yeah.
collective sense of, no matter what happens, we will find a way.
Yeah.
We will persevere. We will find a way. There's nothing, like the biggest problem, we will find a way, and we will do it smiling. We will
Yeah.
do it having fun.
Yes.
And it will be a great time. Bring my beer, please. That's the spirit.
100%.
That's the spirit. And that is the most powerful weapon I think Latin America has in the coming decades, facing the challenges that we will face. And to me, that is at the core, at the heart of what tropical metamodernism has to be about. It has to be about this unstoppable sense of hope, of this faith that something better is on the other side. No matter what the predictions are saying, no matter what the graphs and we will find a way. We will find a way. We will find a way. So that is probably the biggest thing we have going on in our favor. And something else we have going on in our favor is the nature.
Mm.
We have a lot more preserved nature than in Europe. A lot more biodiversity, a lot more of that. And the last thing I will say is, if we look at the climate models and forecasts, actually, Latin America will suffer for sure. There's going to be a lot of desertification. But all in all, we still have a lot of potential in terms of food sovereignty and in terms of water and sovereignty. Latin
Hmm.
America can be completely independent of the rest of the world when it comes to food and water in the coming decades. Completely independent. Brazil alone could feed the whole of Latin America 3 times over. 3 times over. If we stop sending soy to feed pigs in China, we could
Yeah.
feed Latin America 3 times over, just Brazil, right? So I think we have a lot going for us. We have a lot of challenges, of course. Oh, and the last thing, actually, in terms of positive things going for us, we are outside of the main conflict zone.
Yeah. True.
If there's a World War III, US, China, Europe, Latin America is, to not say, that place of the part of the body, I would say it's the elbow of the world,
Yeah.
It's right there. It's the elbow, you barely feel it,
Yeah.
it's no one cares about the elbow. If I go to hit you, I don't hit you in the elbow, right? So
Yeah.
we have that going for us. And I have actually a lot of European friends who moved to Brazil who tell me, I think this is the safest thing I'm doing with my life is
Fair.
moving here, is moving here. So to wrap, tropical metamodernism is given.
Before you
This
wrap,
may ask the
there is
question. The
go
question
for it.
is, the question is, if we if we want to bring about a metamodern society to Latin America, given this context, right, these challenges and these opportunities, these wealths, right, the scarcity and the abundance that we have here that I just described, what should be the new project of development of society that is includes a cultural movement, includes
Hmm.
symbols, includes ideologies, narratives, and tools, paths for investment, for policy, for business, for communities to organize, for new religions to be formed. What are these paths? What is this project? This massive complex project to help to bring the capital, the attention, the resources, the time of Latin American society and funnel that into a development project that does not follow the same path as the US did, as Europe did, but that finds our own way of development, an authentic Latino way, made by Latinos, for the Latino context, that considers all of this and proposes something that tries to get to that metamodern society, tries to create conditions for that metamodern society to emerge. That's what tropical metamodernism is all about.
What an introduction of yourself. That's crazy. And there is many concepts, and as I told you, we will need to record a couple of episodes more to explore more in depth different things that you have mentioned about yourself, about TM. But I want to uh, just recap a bit and let's thinking about this person, about TM. On one arm we have the indigenous wisdom and the connection that we still have, the recent history of that. On the second hand, we have the faith and hope that, for me, does like it. Of course, it comes a lot from a traditional point of view, but it also comes from the fact that it's really difficult to romanticize the past in Latin America, especially the recent past. Our last century was, as you mentioned, there is a lot of collective trauma. And if you ask a person in Chile, hey, do you want to come back to the 80s? Do you want to come back to the 70s? If you ask someone in Brazil, in Argentina, in Colombia, do you want to come back to the 80s? Really difficult. Of course, there is people that say yes, but like a broad majority will say no. So we have that hope. Let's say the indigenous wisdom is one arm, the hope is the other arm. We have our nature, that is unique, abundant, beautiful, diverse. But there is one thing that I want to add, maybe to the other leg, or let's say to put a shirt on it, and is I want to come back to my idea of UPRISE Latino to start to connect that, and is one of the critiques of these modern societies, capitalist societies, their lack of innovation, and by different means, it starts by the ways of music. And I'm surprised because one of the things that we're really good in Latin America is to creating new ways of expressing music in general. And one that I'm especially passionate about is salsa. And there is a beautiful, beautiful video of Isi Zanabria that explains what is salsa. And it says that salsa is our African roots with the bongos, with all the leather instruments. Then you add the indigenous instruments. You add the maracas, you have the guairos, you have all this that is still there, that you can listen when you pay attention. You have the influence of the piano, all the influence of the colonization, all the influence of that. Then you have the influence of the United States with the trumpet, not the trump, but with the trumpet. And from that mixture of things that are usually unrelated, you create something absolutely beautiful and that have marked the story of our region, that is music, especially salsa, at least for me in Colombia. And we create there, and we create our stories from salsa. This is really funny because you go to a Colombian party, to a Venezuelan party, to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and it's a bunch of people dancing. But if you listen to the lyrics, they're talking about the story of those indigenous communities, of those slave communities, of those um, traumas that we had. So that's the point that I want to add. Maybe that shirt that I want to add to you, and is we are really good, and that is connected to what you were saying, because
Yeah.
metamodernism is that capacity of having of taking the best of each part, and is we are really good at integrating things and concepts,
Yes.
because
Yes.
we are in this contact, in this constant look for our identity, that is difficult, that is a path, but we are able to take things from different paths. That's
Yes.
the additional shirt that I want to put to that concept.
Let me complement
What
that.
do you think about that?
I'll finish by saying this. I asked the question of tropical metamodernism.
Hmm.
Now let me give you four hypotheses for that
For
answer.
hypothesis.
Four hypotheses. The first is exactly what you said. It's
So you put the shirt
music.
on. Good.
Music. First is music. And you know what salsa is in Colombia, in Brazil it's samba. Same thing what you said, you know? It's a
Exactly.
mixture of the instruments and it's that thing that moves you, that just moves you, right?
100%.
And to me it's about music as a vehicle for transmitting ideas and and
Yes.
and artists as personas, as symbols of success,
Yeah.
as aspirational symbols. So the hypothesis of music and culture as a whole, right? To music I'll add, you know, what are the movies, what are
Books,
the
paints.
books, the series, what are the TikTokers, what are
100%.
the, you know, the YouTubers, what are the video game creators, you know, like
The
from Latin
podcasters.
America, the podcasters, right, that can through their art convey these ideas of tropical metamodernism and education, of, you know, this what we discussed the whole thing today. But how can we
Mm,
express that in a way that is accessible, that is sexy, that is moving, that is engaging, that is exciting, you know, and that is desirable, that is aspirational? That
mm,
is the power of culture, that is the power of art, is to create symbols of aspiration,
mm.
of desire. symbols of
Yeah.
desire, symbols that moves us, right? Like, what are these songs? What are these movies? What are these TV series? Like, I have this dream of, like this series of, a Netflix series that is just called 2050. And it's, like these utopias across, Latin America. Bogota 2050, Sao Paulo 2050, Mar del Plata 2050. Like, what are these
Mm.
visions of a future, meta-modern Latin America that we can bring to life, to visuals, that people can go, wow, I want to live there. I want to live
Yeah.
in that society. I love that. I love that. This is ours. This is from us. This is not some gringo here coming and telling us what we should do. Not some Hollywood guy telling us, like, this is what development should look like. This is where you should go.
Yeah.
Or some economist from some fucking stupid university in Europe saying, do this and don't do that.
Mm.
No,
Mm.
this is our dream. This is our dream. So what is that? What are those culture artifacts that can bring
Yeah.
about this dream and energize and educate and create the path? So first hypothesis is culture, art. The second hypothesis is religion. And this is, I've expressed this and had discussed with a lot of people, and a lot of people take this badly actually when I speak about religion. Because I think there's still a lot of religious trauma in people's lives in Latin America. A lot of gay children that were kicked out of their houses from evangelical parents that believed that they
Mm.
were cursed.
Mm. Yeah.
And I know more than one story like that.
Yeah.
So it's something that's very alive when talking about religion, especially organized religion, right?
Mm.
That is still, it's a fresh trauma for a lot of people in Latin America. But I think we cannot overlook that. We have to heal from those traumas and learn from the power of religious organizing. These
Yeah.
religious communities are out there. And I think, particularly in the West, we have to speak about Christianity. We have to use the Christian language, formats, structures. This is things that people relate to. If I come to
Yeah.
people here, like in the middle of Brazil, in the small town, and I start talking about indigenous wisdom, they're gonna say,
They are
like,
not. Yeah.
devil,
Yeah.
devil, devil, get out of here. But if I
Yeah.
come to them and I start talking about an alternative reading of Christianity, right? If I
Mm.
start speaking about the Gnostic Gospels, right? All the Dead Sea Scrolls, all the other Christian texts, the early Christian wisdom that was forbidden in the early Christianity because of the
Mm.
orthodoxy, but that is so beautiful. That talks about the power of the soul, the power of creation, the potential
Yeah.
inside everyone. That talks about the kingdom of heaven being in earth, not the second thing, not this thing
Mm.
you die and then you go. This is a
Mm.
medieval creation.
Yes.
This is not the early Christian belief. That's the crazy thing,
Mm.
So, like, going back to that, or the real essence of Christianity, right?
Mm.
And just as, traditional orthodoxy is one interpretation of Christian teaching, why not propose another?
Yeah. Yeah.
Latin America is the place where there was the highest conversion from Catholic to evangelical, to Pentecostal,
Mm-hmm.
Neo-Pentecostal.
Yeah.
Why not, again, go from Neo-Pentecostal evangelical to a new form of Christianity, one that is
Yeah.
meta-modern? What is this Latino meta-modern Christianity
Yeah.
that talks about really the essence of it, the soul, the
Mm.
potential, the fairness, the love, the truth, the beauty, in objective
And
terms?
that connects with that indigenous concepts that
For
are still
sure,
so close to us,
for
of
sure, for
community,
sure.
of seeing the divine in nature, of seeing the divine in the other.
These concepts, they are archetypical concepts. These are
Yeah.
not Christian concepts. They are not indigenous
Exactly.
concepts. They are not Taoist, Hindu, Jewish. They
Yeah.
are archetypical concepts. When you study comparative mythology, in the work of Joseph Campbell, and you see all the different kinds of myths and narratives and stories and cosmologies and beliefs and value systems across the whole world, some things appear everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
It's about getting those things and putting them at the center of a new metamodern Christian belief. So to me,
Good.
the second hypothesis, which is religion, is all about that. And of course, there will be a revival of other forms of religions and beliefs and reformations
100%.
and indigenous religions, coming back and in ways that are metamodern, right? But to me, that's a second very, very crucial part. The third hypothesis actually goes back to what you were talking about, if you ask people here, do you want to go back to the 80s? And the sad answer that Brazil gave to that question in 2018 was, yes, we want to go back to the 80s. So as much as I would love to agree with you, I actually think a lot of people would die to bring back a military dictatorship in Brazil, across Latin America. I think in Colombia it's a little bit fresher for you guys because of the whole problem with the narcos and the FARCs and whatnot. But in Brazil, it's already kind of a generation. It's been, like 50 years, almost 40 years. So the conservative, the far right, it's very strong here. And this third point, the third hypothesis, is a national mental health program. National mental health program, publicly funded, democratic, available, accessible, high quality. Has to happen. Why? Because if we actually don't start dealing with the traumas, individual and collective traumas today, we will not have the conditions present to even take the next step. Because we were witnessing today this far right extremism in the rise. We have to deal with it today. And my personal theory of change and the theory of change of tropical metamodernism is these people want to make Brazil great again or make, whatever great again because they're afraid. The world is changing. Yes. The world is changing so fast. They don't understand what's going on. They get anxiety. They're afraid. They don't know. And to deal with that, anyone that says, I'm going to bring back stability and like order, progress and order, the good days are going to come back. They just fall prey to that, right? So to solve that, we really need to help these people just loosen a bit, just relax a bit and say, listen, it's okay. I don't know what's going on, but we will find a way. And I don't have to feel all this sadness and this pain and this anxiety, right? We need to support these people. These people are suffering. I look at people in far right marching in Sao Paulo and I feel sorry for them. I feel their pain. Yeah. They're lost, man. They're going through crisis of anxiety. I know, like my grandmother, friends, parents of my friends that are taking medicine and are becoming alcoholics and becoming, just losing themselves completely because of this fear, because of this anxiety, because they don't know what's going on. They're afraid. They're in pain. And I feel for them. I really feel for them. So we have to take care of these people. We really need a national program to take care of people's mental health, to help them deal through this, to heal from their traumas, reduce their anxiety. They can just chillax a bit. I have been giving cannabidiol, CBD to my grandma. It's been helping so much. Helping so much. So mental health. We have to have public policies around mental health. That's hypothesis number 3 of how we get to a metabolic society. And the last one is through reinventing business. Because of the financial scarcity and poverty in Latin America, if there's one thing that is universal, is that people have to work. Yeah. And if people stop working, next month they don't have anything. Yeah. They don't have any savings. And actually, they already don't have any savings because they're in debt. So people have to work. That is what gives them the minimum level of stability and conditions to do whatever they want with their
Sustenance.
lives.
Yeah.
That is, a challenge, because of course it's way easier, as a Swede to say, I'll take a gap year, I'll go a sabbatical.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go to India, I'm gonna do this retreat, ayahuasca, I'm going to, start painting and go through this personal development journey. So beautiful, man, congratulations. You can't do that in Latin America. Only the elite can do that in Latin America, but the vast majority can do that. So, if we are able to change business, and by changing business, I mean really changing the foundational structures, the legal structures that define what a company is, what is the purpose of a company, how investments are made, what are the criteria for investments, responsible investments, enshrining that, right? From the very, very core up into management and governance and strategy and team management and team building and task, from the most basis to the most operational and day-to-day tasks, everything in between has to be centered around a new concept of business. That business is supposed to give a profit. Yes, of course, that is at the core of it. But it's only supposed to give a profit if it's not causing more destruction during the process. And that is the biggest lie that neoliberal economics, and orthodox, economics, classical economics even have told us, that value, all different forms of value, have been reduced to one form of value, which is the financial value.
Revenue. Yeah.
Financial value. And actually, we know that there's more value in the world than financial value.
Mm-hmm.
There's beauty, there's love, there's development, psychological value.
Yeah.
There's collective, social development of new cultures. There's art. All these things are valuable. But we reduced everything to the number in dollars. It's not even in our own currencies, for Christ's sake. We just put it in dollars to add insult to injury. We need a new form of business. And the mechanisms to measure, to understand, through dialogue, quantitative and qualitative, how can businesses keep operating, being profitable, while at the same time not causing more destruction for the environment, not causing more destruction for our societies? For example, businesses that clearly are just fucking us up. Like in Brazil right now, we have this big issue with the gambling industry, with the sporting bets.
Yeah.
It's destroying the poorest. The poorest people in Brazil are the most vulnerable to this. Just in August, 30% of all the budget of Bolsa Familia, the program that funds food and does cash transfers for the poorest people, 30% of all
Went
the
to
money
gambling.
although these people received, 30% they spent in gambling in 1 month. It is destroying. This kind of business should be illegal, period. No. Just not, or definitely not this way. Create guardrails so that these companies are extremely profitable. If you look at it just from a business sense, amazing businesses, right? But if you look from a holistic sense, they're destroying our societies, destroying. So businesses should not destroy our environment, should not destroy our societies with products and services that clearly are net negative, holistically speaking. And they should not destroy the mental health and the lives of their employees and suppliers. They should not abuse, propose violence, manipulate, or cause burnout. All of these things are net negative for society. There's no profit in the world that should justify someone getting a fucking burnout. There's no profit in the world. So if we can reinvent a format and mechanisms and agreements from the legal to the operational that allow our businesses to be net positive, holistically net positive for society, for the individuals, and for the environment, we will completely take off. And I have more faith in Latin America in doing this than in Europe. Because I have to have faith. I have to have faith.
and because we will do it with a smile in our faces. 100%. Unfortunately, this we are just in the end of this conversation. It's not going to be the last one. I'm absolutely sure it's not going to be the last one. We have so many other concepts to explore. We have so much depth to get into. But I want to thank you, TM, for taking your time and having this conversation with me. I will just leave the people that are listening with a small message connecting again to the beginning of this. And that was the idea of UPRISE Latino. That was the idea of UPRISE Latino. In the sense of right now is the moment to act. And Tropical Metamodernism is the way to go. We have a moment where we need to act. That's why it's UPRISE. But we need a north so that we can come together as a region and transform ourselves, and in that same way transform the rest of the world with our influence. So yeah, that's all for today. Thank you so much for this time, and thank you so much for the people that listen to the podcast. I'm sure if you are more interested, I will leave a bunch of information of what TM has said today in the description. And yeah, I'm sure that in couple of months or couple of episodes, we are going to have maybe a second one if we manage to fit some time for the two of us. But thank you so much. I send you a huge hug from cold Sweden, and yeah, have an amazing day.